All right, there's 4 sources in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. 4 stories that we know came together. One was called the priestly, there's a source called the priestly, and it used the name Elohim or El Shaddai for God. And I believe El is the root word for Ella as well. So, and that's usually translated as God or the gods, because Elohim is utilized as plural in the beginning books of the Bible. And it's newer than the Yahwist version. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because Genesis 1, which is the first story, isn't as old as Genesis 2. Genesis 2 contains, the Yahwist version contains the story, for example, of Adam and Eve. And that's older than the very first book in the Bible. But they decided to put the newer version first, and well, it isn't, and I think it's because it deals with more fundamental abstractions. It's something like that. It's like it deals with the most basic of abstractions, how the universe was created, and then segues into what the human environment is like. And so that seems to be the logic behind it. The Yahwist version uses the name YHWH, which apparently people didn't say, but we believe was pronounced something like Yahweh. And it has a strongly anthropomorphic God, so one that takes human form. It begins with Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when, and it contains the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and the Tower of Babel and Exodus and Numbers, along with the priestly version. It also contains the law in the form, just the form of the 10 Commandments, which is like a truncated form of the law. There's the Elohist source. It contains the stories of Abraham and Isaac. It's concerned with a heavenly hierarchy that includes angels. It talks about the departure from Egypt, and it presents the covenant code, which is this idea of that, that society is predicated. This was Israeli society. It was predicated on a covenant with God, and that's laid out in a sequence of rules, some of which are the 10 Commandments, but many of which are much more extensive than that. And then the final one is the Deuteronomist code, and it contains the bulk of the law and what's called the Deuteronomic history, and it's independent of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And so we know that at least now there's debate about this like there is about everything, so I'm brushing over a very large area of scholarship, but people generally assume that there were multiple authors over multiple periods of time, and the way they've concluded that is by looking at textual analysis, trying to see where there are chunks of the stories that have the same kind of style or the same reference. And people argue about that because, obviously it's difficult to recreate something ancient, but that's the basic idea. So it is an amalgam of viewpoints about these initial issues, and that's important to know. So it's like it's a collective story. And, okay, now, to understand the first part of Genesis, I'm going to turn, strangely enough, to something that's actually part of the New Testament, and this is a central element of Christianity. And it's a very strange idea, and it's going to take a very long time to unpack, but the idea, this is what John said about Christ. He said, in the beginning was the Word, and so that relates back to Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Three sentences like that take a lot of unpacking because, well, none of that seems to make any sense whatsoever, really, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was both with God, and the Word was God. So the first question might be, what in the world does that mean? In the beginning was the Word. That's the Logos, actually. And the Logos is embodied in the figure of Christ. So there's this idea in John that whatever Christ is, the Son of God, is not only instantiated in history, say at a particular time and place as a carpenter in some backwoods part of the world, but also something eternal that exists outside of time and space that was there right at the beginning. And as far as I can tell, what that Logos represents is something like modern people. It's something like what modern people refer to when they talk about consciousness. It's something like that. It's more than that. It's like consciousness and its capacity to be aware and its capacity to communicate. It's something like that. And there's an idea underneath that, which is that being, especially from a phenomenological perspective, so the being that is experience cannot exist without consciousness. It's like consciousness shines a light on things to bring it into being. Because without consciousness, what is there? No one experiences anything. He's like, is there anything when no one experiences anything? That's the question. And the answer that this book is presenting is that, no, you have to think about consciousness as a constituent element of reality. It's something that's necessary for reality itself to exist. Now, of course, it depends on what you mean by reality. But the reality that's being referred to here, I told you already, is this strange amalgam of the subjective experience and the world. But the question is deeper than that too, because it is by no means obvious what there is if there's no one to experience it. I mean, the whole notion of time itself seems to collapse, at least in terms of something like felt duration. And then the notion of size disappears essentially because there's nothing to scale it, and the causality seems to vanish. And so, and we don't understand consciousness, not in the least. We don't understand what it is that is in us that gives illumination to being. And what happens in the Old Testament, at least in part, is that that consciousness is associated with the divine. Now you think, well, is that a reasonable proposition? And that's a very complicated question, but at least we might note that there's something to the claim, because there is a miracle of experience and existence that's dependent on consciousness. I mean, people try to explain it away constantly, but it doesn't seem to work very well. And here's something else to think about, I think, that's really worth thinking about. People do not like it when you treat them like they're not conscious, right? They react very badly to that. And then you don't like it if someone assumes that you're not conscious, and you don't like it if someone assumes that you don't have free will, you know, that you're just absolutely determined in your actions, and there's nothing that's going to repair you, and that you don't need to have any responsibility for your actions. It's like our culture, the laws of our culture are predicated on the idea, something like people are conscious, people have experience, people make decisions and can be held responsible for them, that there's a free will element to it. And you can debate all that philosophically, and fine, but the point is that that is how we act, and that is the idea that our legal system is predicated on. And there's something deep about it, because, you know, you're subject to the law, but the law is also limited by you, which is to say that in a well-functioning, properly grounded democratic system, you have intrinsic value. That's the source of your rights. Even if you're a murderer, we have to say, the law can only go so far because there's something about you that's divine. Well, what does that mean? Well, partly it means that there's something about you that's conscious and capable of communicating, like you're a whole world unto yourself. And you have that to contribute to everyone else, and that's valuable. I mean, that you can learn new things, you can transform the structure of society, you can invent a new way of dealing with the world. You're capable of all that. It's an intrinsic part of you, and that's associated with this. It's associated, that's the idea there, is that there's something about the logos that is necessary for the absolute chaos of the reality beyond experience to manifest itself as reality. It's an amazing idea because it gives consciousness a constitutive role in the cosmos. And you can debate that, but you know, it's not, you can't just bloody well brush it off. Because first of all, we are the most complicated things there are that we know of by a massive amount. We're so complicated that it's unbelievable. And so, you know, there's a lot of cosmos out there, but there's a lot of cosmos in here too. And which one is greater is by no means obvious unless you use something trivial like relative size, which, you know, really isn't a very sophisticated approach. And whatever it is that is you has this capacity to experience reality and to transform it, which is a very strange thing, you know. You can conceptualize a future in your imagination, and then you can work and make that manifest. You participate in the process of creation. That's one way of thinking about it. And so that's why I think in Genesis 1, it relates the idea that human beings are made in the image of the divine, men and women, which is interesting too, because, you know, the feminists are always criticizing Christianity, for example, as being, inexorably patriarchal. Of course, they criticize everything like that, so it's hardly a stroke of bloody brilliance. But I think it's an absolute miracle that right at the beginning of the document, it says straightforwardly, like with no hesitation whatsoever, that the divine spark, which we're associating with the word that brings forth being, is manifest in men and women equally. That's a very cool thing. And you got to think, well, like I said, do you actually take that seriously? Well, what you got to ask is, what happens if you don't take it seriously? Right? Read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. That's the best investigation of that tactic that's ever been produced. Because what happens in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is that the main character, whose name is Raskolnikov, decides that there's no intrinsic value to other people. And that as a consequence, he can do whatever he wants. It's only cowardice that stops him from acting, right? Because why would it be anything else if the value of other people is just an arbitrary superstition? Then why can't I do exactly what I want when I want? Which is the psychopath's viewpoint. Well, so Raskolnikov does. He kills someone who's a very horrible person, and he has very good reasons for killing her. And he's half-starved and a little bit insane and possessed by this ideology. It's brilliant, brilliant layout. And he finds out something after he kills her, which is that the post-killing Raskolnikov and the pre-killing Raskolnikov are not the same person even a little bit. Because he's broken a rule, like he's broken a serious rule, and there's no going back. And Crime and Punishment is the best investigation I know of what happens if you take the notion that there's nothing divine about the individual seriously. Now, most of the people I know who are deeply atheistic, and I understand why they're deeply atheistic, they haven't contended with people like Dostoevsky, not as far as I can tell. Because I don't see logical flaws in Crime and Punishment. I think he got the psychology exactly right. And Dostoevsky's amazing for this, because in one of his books, The Devils, for example, he describes a political scenario that's not much different than the one we find ourselves in now. And there are these people who are possessed by rationalistic, utopian, atheistic ideas. And they're very powerful. They give rise to the communist revolution, right? I mean, they're powerful ideas. And his character, Stavrogan, also acts out the presupposition that human beings have no intrinsic nature and no intrinsic value. And it's another brilliant investigation. And Dostoevsky prophesies, that's what I would say, what will happen to a society if it goes down that road? And he was dead exactly accurate. It's uncanny to read Dostoevsky's The Possessed or The Devils, depending on the translation, and then to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, because one is fiction and prophecy, and the second is, hey, look, it turned out exactly the way that Dostoevsky said it would for exactly the same reasons. So it's quite remarkable. So the question is, do you contend seriously with the idea that A, there's something cosmically constitutive about consciousness, and B, that might well be considered divine, and C, that is instantiated in every person? And then ask yourself, if you're not a criminal, if you don't act it out. And then ask yourself what that means. Is that reflective of a reality? Is it a metaphor? Like maybe it's a metaphor, a complex metaphor that we have to use to organize our societies. Could well be, but even as a metaphor, it's true enough so that we mess with it at our peril. And it also took people a very long time to figure out. This is Genesis 1. You know what, I'm probably going to stop there because I believe it's 9:30. And so we didn't even get to the first line. Yeah. Look, I want to read you a couple of things that we'll use as a prodroma for the next lecture, because I'll just bounce through a collection of ideas that's associated with the notion of divinity, okay? And then we'll turn back to the first lines when we start the next lecture. I have no idea how far I'm going to get through the biblical stories, by the way, because I'm trying to figure this out as I go along. Okay, so, there's an idea in Christianity that the image of God is a trinity, right? There's the Father, there's the element of the Father, there's the element of the Son, and there's the element of the Holy Spirit. And it's something like tradition, the spirit of tradition. It's something like the human being as the newest incarnation of that tradition, like the living incarnation of that tradition. And then it's something like the spirit in people that makes relationship with this and this possible, the spirit in individuals. And so I'm going to bounce my way quickly through some of the classical metaphorical attributes of God so that we kind of have a cloud of notions about what we're talking about when we return to Genesis 1 and talk about the God who spoke chaos into being. So there's a fatherly aspect. So here's what God as a father is like. You can enter into a covenant with it, so you can make a bargain with it. Now you think about that, money is like that, because money is a bargain you make with the future, right? And so we've structured our world so that you can negotiate with the future. And I don't think that we would have got to the point where we could do that without having this idea to begin with. You can act as if the future's a reality.